You know, when you hear the word Upanishads, you probably think of these ancient mystical texts, just brimming with deep spiritual wisdom. And you'd be right. But what if they're more than that? What if they also hold a secret history, a hidden story of a world that was changing in massive ways? That's what we're going to dig into. The name itself, Upanishad, actually gives us our first big clue. It literally means to sit down near. I mean, you can just picture it, can't you? A student sitting right at the feet of their guru, getting this incredible knowledge, not from a dusty old book, but through this intense one-on-one conversation. That was the absolute heart of education back then.
Okay, but here's the twist. While all these deep conversations were about, the soul and the nature of reality, they didn't happen in some kind of void. They happened in a real society with kings and scholars and social rules, the whole thing. So what if these dialogues are also a kind of accidental historical record of that world?
And that is exactly how historians approach these texts today. Yeah, they're cornerstones of philosophy, for sure. But historians also see them as this incredibly valuable source. They're like a time capsule filled with conversations, giving us this rare peek into the minds and the culture of ancient India. And just think about that time frame for a second. We're talking almost 3,000 years ago. For a period where we just don't have a lot of other historical records, these texts are an absolute goldmine. They've preserved the intellectual pulse of an entire era, an era that would go on to shape, well, pretty much the whole world. So when we peek through this window into the past, what do we actually see? Well, let's start with the society itself. The class structure, the politics, the culture that was the backdrop for all these amazing philosophical debates. So the texts mention what's known as the Varna system. It's a social framework with four main groups. You've got the Brahmins, the priests, the Kshatriyas, the warriors and rulers, the Vaishyas, the merchants, and the Shudras, the laborers. Now, on the surface, that looks like a pretty rigid, top-down hierarchy. But the Upanishads hint that it was way more complicated than that. And this is where it gets really interesting. You start to see moments in the Upanishads that just flip that simple hierarchy right on its head. I'm talking about these fascinating stories where the lines get totally blurred, where a warrior king might actually have deeper spiritual knowledge than a priest. Take, for example, the story of King Ajatashatru. He's a Kshatriya, a warrior, and we have a record of him teaching a Brahmin priest. Now, for a historian, a little detail like that is huge. It tells us that in this ancient world, knowledge, pure knowledge, could be a source of authority so powerful that it could actually transcend your social class. It wasn't a monopoly. And these kings, they weren't just flexing their military muscle, they were patrons of learning. The Upanishads paint this amazing picture of royal courts that were less about politics and more like ancient think tanks. You had kings like Janaka who would host these massive debates, and they'd reward the wisest thinkers with patronage, usually cows and gold, which were the big ticket items back then. Okay, so knowledge was clearly a huge deal. But how was it actually passed down? Let's dive into that because the Upanishads give us this incredible look at the unique education system of the time. It was called the Gurukul system, and believe me, this was not your typical school. Students would literally go and live with their teacher, their guru, and become part of the family. Education wasn't a subject. It was a whole way of life that you absorbed over years of service, discussion, and constant debate. And through these dialogues, we get to meet the intellectual rock stars of the age. I mean, names like Yajnavalkya, Udalaka Aruni, and his son Shvetaketu, they became legends. These were the guys wrestling with the biggest questions you can imagine about life, the universe, and everything. But wait. The secret history hidden in these texts reveals something pretty amazing. The brilliant minds pushing the frontiers of human thought, well, they weren't all men. That's right. At a time when women in many other ancient cultures were pretty much excluded from public life, the Upanishads show us these brilliant female philosophers taking part in the biggest intellectual debates, right there alongside the men. For anyone trying to understand this society, that is a crucial piece of the puzzle. We learn about Gargi Vachaknavi, who just boldly stands up in the king's court and relentlessly questions the greatest sage of the day, Yajnavalkya. And then there's Maitreyi, who tells her husband, who happens to be the same sage, Yajnavalkya, that she doesn't want wealth. She wants him to teach her the path to immortality. I mean, these women were not just sitting on the sidelines. They were powerful intellectual forces.
So you have all these different people, kings, students, women scholars, all contributing. And they're all part of this incredible, massive shift in thinking. The Upanishads don't just record a little bit of history. They represent a full-blown revolution in human thought.
You can see it right here. The earlier religious focus was all about external things, rituals you performed, sacrifices you made to different gods. The Upanishads basically flipped that script entirely. They said, no, true understanding doesn't come from out there, it comes from in here, from introspection, from looking inward to find a single ultimate reality.
And out of this intellectual revolution came these incredible concepts that honestly changed everything. Ideas like Atman, the individual soul, Brahman, the universal consciousness, and, of course, karma and moksha, or liberation. These huge philosophical breakthroughs, born right here in the Upanishads, became the foundation for Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism.
Now, this all sounds amazing, like we've found the perfect historical record. But, and this is a big but, using a philosophical text to do history requires a lot of skill and even more caution. You really have to learn to read between the lines. And that's the critical question, isn't it? The people writing these texts were not trying to be historians. Their goal was spiritual, philosophical. So how can we trust what they're saying about the world around them?
Well, historians approach them with a very healthy dose of skepticism. They have a kind of checklist of things to remember. First, these texts don't give us dates or a clear timeline. Second, a lot of the language is symbolic, not literal. And third, they're definitely not objective. That's why everything we learn from them has to be cross-referenced with other sources, like archaeology or later texts.
But here's the thing. Even with all those limitations, the Upanishads are priceless. Why? Because they offer something that a piece of pottery or a building ruin never ever can, a direct voice from the past. They tell us not just what people did, but what they thought, what they argued about, what really mattered to them, and you just can't get that anywhere else.
In the end, what the Upanishads really show us is that history isn't always found where you expect it, in official records or chronicles. Sometimes it's hidden in stories, in debates, in the search for meaning. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other huge secrets are out there, just hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to look at them in a whole new way?